I'm less interested in low-hanging fruit, pun intended, because it's obvious. And so what I have sought to do instead is to underscore how profoundly queerness structures world art in all sorts of different ways, that the arts have long been a refuge for queers, right? Precisely in some respects, because they found a way to make art speak out of both sides of its mouth.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. Happy summer season. It's Dr. Andrew Rimby, aka Andrew, and I am so excited for you all to listen to what I hope you'll find to be a really enjoyable episode. So, before the episode begins, I just want to remind you all to please follow us on our YouTube channel, Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Make sure you rate us on Apple and give us a review. It really means a lot. You also can rate us on Spotify. If you need help doing any of that, as always, you can feel free to reach out to me, DM me on any of our social media accounts. I'm looking at them every day. Patreon, we have ad-free episodes and bonus content, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and you get a 1 week free trial. We also have our book club, which is free and virtual. So, this month, well, technically August, we are reading The Silent Patient, which is such an exciting psychological thriller. I've been told by the book club members who voted on it. August 3rd at 5 p.m. Email me at ivorytowerboilerroom@gmail.com for the Zoom link, or DM me and I'll get you the Zoom link. And I can't wait for us to discuss The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. So, without further ado, here is today's Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I am really excited to be joined with a guest who I've known about since my time as a PhD student, now an academic teaching and leaping over the PhD, is Dr. Jonathan D. Katz, who is just an incredible historian of art, gender, sexuality. He teaches at University of Pennsylvania. He's an associate professor of practice, and he's the founding figure, one of the founding figures. I'll say that because one time someone wrote to me in the comments and said, there's other founding figures. So I always have that in the back of my mind. But a founding figure in queer art history, responsible for the very first queer scholarship on a number of artists. He has written all the way from the late 19th century to the present. He focuses a lot of his work on the US, but also Europe, Latin America, and Asia. He's written extensively about gender, sexuality, desire, produced a lot of theoretical work in queer studies in the visual arts. His books include Hide and Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, Difference or Indifference, Musings on Postmodernism. I think it's pronounced Marcel Duchamp and John Cage, but I might have said the French name wrong. So if I did, Jonathan can jump in. Um, he has just come out with a really exciting book called The First Homosexuals, which a lot of our interview is going to be geared towards that and his new exhibit in Chicago. He has two anthologies out, The Routledge Companion to Queer Art History and About Face, Stonewall Revolt, and New Queer Art. And if you haven't gotten enough of his writing, he is working on a manuscript called Hiding in Plain Sight, American Art History Queered. And like I've said, his international exhibition is called The First Homosexuals at the Wrightwood in Chicago, which analyzes the art created around the globe in the first 50 years after the term homosexual was coined. So, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
I was so excited to learn that you were going to be guest editing the Gay and Lesbian Review magazine centered on your exhibition theme, your book's theme, The First Homosexuals. So I'm kind of, before we dig into the articles that are here in the Gay and Lesbian Review, how did this whole project come to be? Like, was it inspired by other exhibits you've curated before?
Yes, in fact, what I really wanted to do was to investigate that moment when sexuality, which had once been holistic and homo and hetero conjoined, started to split apart. I was really interested in coming to understand how we came to understand homosexuality as it were, a different species from heterosexuality, when once in the Western world they were conjoined, and
Mm.
they are conjoined in about 80% of the rest of the world. So it seemed a particularly European and colonial perversion to understand homosexuality as not just a species apart, but of course, a denigrated one. And I wanted to get that history. Um, and so, really, I thought the best way to do that was to expand the focus beyond Europe and its colonies and come to understand that homophobia and the idea of a discrete homosexual identity is a kind of European perversion that unfortunately was globalized on the backs of colonialism.
Mm. So, as a historian of, is it safe to call it queer visual arts in a way?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, I've had on the author of Hard to Imagine, Thomas Wall, and we got into a whole discussion about homoerotic photography, and everyone can listen to that. But I'm just curious, like, what do you even make of? I'm sure your students at UPenn, they come in, and maybe some of them have more of an understanding of homoerotic visual arts than others. Do you ever get that question of, oh, the ancient Greeks were gay? And like,
Right,
how do you handle that when it comes to that being such a touching foundation for so many in pop culture, just thinking, oh, they were gay and
right,
homosexuality exists starting with the ancient
right.
Greeks.
And the first thing I've always tried to teach my students is that sexuality is historical, and the only truth of history is that it will change. And so when we understand, for example, that the ancient Greeks weren't elevating the idea of gender in their relationships with one another, but rather the idea of power, and effectively a boy's butt, a slave's body, or a woman's vagina were functional equivalent by virtue of the hierarchy of power in Greek society, then they come to understand that it's really inappropriate to refer to it as gay. And indeed, one of the things that I'm trying to, in this exhibition, underscore is that the creation of the category gay was itself an ideological intervention.
Hmm. When you were, take us back maybe to young Jonathan Katz and his PhD work. Where did you do your PhD work, Jonathan?
Well, I've been kicked out of the best grad schools in the country. Um, I got kicked out of the University of Chicago. I got kicked out of Johns Hopkins, and left Yale and ended up at Northwestern. And this was because I was doing queer studies in the dark days of the Reagan administration, the early days of AIDS, and what I did was highly politically suspect. And I kept running into people. I mean, quite literally at the University of Chicago, when I announced my dissertation topic, my advisor cut my fellowship and said that
Wow.
he would restore it only if I changed my topic. Um,
Mm.
so, I wrote the second dissertation in the field of queer art history, and doing this kind of work in those days was highly charged. Art history was such a conservative discipline that I got into trouble for working on living artists even before I got into trouble working on queer artists.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And so, are you, not to date you, and not should never ask a queer man his age,
Oh,
but
I'm 66.
okay. So, like, are we talking about the days of David Halperin and Eve Sedgwick, or
Even before then.
okay, so more like Boswell?
Yeah, in fact,
Okay.
Boswell's book was one of the only things around in my youth. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess for everyone out there, if you've never read Boswell, I can't remember the name right now, but I know it's
Christian
about
tolerance
queer.
and homosexuality.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, like queer Christianity in a way. So 100 years of homosexuality, that's in the 90s. So this is before all of that work has been done. So like you're really, as you've explained, kicked out of programs, and you're in a pressure cooker situation, but you decide to stay true to your passion. So like what kept you going when the topic of queer art was so key to what you wanted to research?
I don't think it's possible to underestimate the force of a pissed off queen. And I was a pissed off queen, right? I kept going to these classes in which queer artists were never addressed in terms of their sexuality, in which I could see the role of sexuality in the making of the image. But when I raised it, I was told that it was self-interested critique. Um, this was also an era in which, because of AIDS, and this was, of course, before we knew about HIV and its transmission, the professors would have like dinners at class for the class, and I would be pulled aside and said, Katz, I hope you understand I have children. I can't have you at my house. So there was so many insults. The University of Chicago had a spate of homophobia that lasted 2 years. It was more than a spate, called the Great White Brotherhood of the Iron Fist. It turns out to have been a bunch of graduate students funded by the Dartmouth Review, the conservative journal, who were outing people. And I woke up one day and my car was covered with bumper stickers that said, "Clean up Hyde Park, stop AIDS, kill a faggot." Um, and all of this was being essentially unpoliced by the university, which insisted that a university was a place where opposite sides can sit down over a dinner table and discuss their differences. And that's what I should do. Um, so, anyway, the point is, those were really dark days. There was lots of oppression, and I was furious.
Yeah. Well, as you should have been.
Mhm.
So I'm assuming then when you're getting your PhD, History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault isn't all the rage. It's not like you need to read this. This is the key book. He says the homosexual is now a species.
Right, right. No, no, that was not at all going on. And in fact, um, I now teach a course called The Sexuality of Postmodernism, in which I make the point that what's interesting in theoretical terms is, at least in the art world, is that the rise of postmodernism and with it the discourse of the death of an author, the idea that authors aren't responsible for the meaning of their work, but rather the audience is, coincided with the moment in which authors who were queer, authors who were of color, authors who were women were finally finding their voice. So I found it very, call me paranoid, but I'm struck by the fact that the moment that the others start to assert themselves, dominant culture says, oh, well, the author doesn't mean anything.
Mm, a backlash of sorts in a way.
But a
Yeah.
theoretically informed backlash that evades the charge of prejudice.
Interesting. So, in your academic work and just having such an aerial view of queer studies, when do you feel the explosion of, oh, queer studies isn't going away? Like just book after book is being published. Is that really fair to say that the early 90s is when queer studies really starts to just, take off and become more mainstream in academic culture?
Absolutely. And I would date it actually a little bit earlier to 1988 to maybe 1995. In fact, we used to hold these early queer studies conferences, Yale and at Harvard and at other universities on an annual basis. We were a small group. Um, in fact, I was the respondent for Judith Butler when she gave a paper on the performance of gender, which ultimately became, of course, the whole phenomenon of Judith Butler. And Judith was furious with me because I basically responded to her paper, or their paper now, by saying, it's brilliant, but it's nothing that a drag queen doesn't already know. Um, and and because I've always felt that the true test is, of course, to speak to the culture that enables what we're doing in the first place. I stand on other shoulders, and I have to acknowledge that.
Mm. Well, what do you feel now? Because, this probably goes right into, hopefully, what you've talked about with your vision of the first homosexuals work that you're doing, the exhibit, the book, you guest editing the issue of Gay and Lesbian Review. Is I've just been reading a lot this new book called Girl on Girl, which is about post-feminism in the 1990s and like girl groups, the Spice Girls, even Madonna as an artist, Janet Jackson, and like how there's now this more palpable, uh, digestible version of feminism that kind of starts to erase the political grittiness of like the Riot Girls. And I'm kind
Right.
of curious, do you feel that we're in that space now, even in queer studies in academia and even in pop culture at large, where it might not feel as, I don't want to say it doesn't feel earth shattering, but a lot of the political charge that you can hear in your early work. When I read your early work, I hear it. Judith Butler's work, Eve Sedgwick, David Halperin, et cetera, et cetera. Jose Munez's Cruising Utopia. Do you feel like we've kind of lost some of that grittiness, or has it just changed the direction?
I will say that I think my answer is colored by being an art historian, which is a particularly backward profession. But it hasn't changed at all for me because when I did the first homosexuals, 90% of the museum loans I sought were denied. And I spent 3 years trying to travel the show, and no other museum would take it. Literally, in 2 weeks, an exhibition called Painting Men that was at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris and then was at the Getty Museum under the title Painting Caillebotte, the French Impressionist Painting Men, is now at the Art Institute of Chicago, where it is called Caillebotte Painting His World. And so at the same time that my first homosexuals is at Wrightwood 659 in Chicago, at the Art Institute of Chicago, they're fucking denying the existence of a queer impressionist, one of the very few whose subjects were about 78% men.
I was recently watching Return to Oz and Nosferatu with my fiance, and I thought, wait, I just had on Broadview Press authors who wrote a vampire literature anthology and the iconic edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So I said to my fiance, you know what? I need to tell everyone who's listening to ITBR that BroadviewPress.com has everything from classic novels to discussions about vampire literature, vampires in film and TV, the philosophy of sports, Native American culture, horror. There is so much on Broadview Press's website. I urge you all right now, search broadviewpress.com. You will see that not only do they have books for college instructors, which if you do teach college, you better add them to your list because it's amazing, all the resources they have. But if you have just wandered around a bookstore or a library and thought, everyone always told me to read Moby Dick, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to fully understand it. Broadviewpress.com has you covered because they have amazing notes and sources to help you dissect that huge whale of a tale. See what I did there? I was just watching the Page Master, so there's a little Moby Dick reference. Head to broadviewpress.com, use the exclusive code they gave us, Ivory Tower, 20% off your entire order. Yes, your entire order. Enjoy your reading, and please reach out to me and let me know what you're reading from Broadview Press. I would love to share it on social media.
Rather unusual
Wow.
for Christianism, right? So this whole attitude of, passéness, I long for, because for me, we are right in the middle of the fight.
Mm. Well, and maybe that's also, I remember when I was writing my dissertation, and it's all about Walt Whitman's homoerotic poetics and his use of ancient Greek culture and philosophy, and Oscar Wilde borrowing from it to write The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I even was getting, not necessarily about that work, but more when I was applying to jobs, that oh, doing queer work, that's accepted in all English departments, or, you know, there's a lot of openness. But I was still getting some advice from scholars who were saying the opposite. Like, don't talk about your queer writing. Like, don't talk about what, how your identity intersects with your academic analysis. So it
Well,
is, you're right. It's kind of like, at the one hand, saying, oh, visibility is everywhere and there is no more tokenism. But then at the other hand, it's saying, oh, no, you should be careful when you're applying for jobs. So,
absolutely.
like, it's an odd push pull.
And I think that what has happened, unfortunately, is that certain fields have pulled far ahead, English being one of them, in which questions of sexuality can be addressed relatively freely. But other fields like art history are still in the dark ages. And of course, a lot of that is structural. Nobody gives a damn about a poet's sexuality because no money rides on it. But when you're talking about multi-million dollar works of art, and you're talking about the people who own multi-million dollar works of art, who are, of course, the people who name museum wings after themselves and whose collections enrich encyclopedic museums, that's where the conservatism comes into play.
And if I'm correct, you're also the founding director, I want to get the title right, of the Leslie Loman Museum in New
Yes,
York City. Okay.
yes, yeah.
So I rave about the Leslie Loman to everyone. I live right outside of New York City, and it's the only space where you still can go for free, donation encouraged, and the exhibit space is incredible. Like, how did that come to be, even with you realizing, was it realizing there needs to be an LGBT art space, or did it enter your way just someone asking you to create a space?
Well, actually, there was a space run by Charles Leslie and Fritz Lohman that actually goes all the way back to the founding days of AIDS because they came to realize that men were dying and their works of art were being put on the sidewalk as trash. And so they founded the Leslie Lohman in part to preserve that history and to create a market for queer art. Um, but it was a gallery, not a museum. I'm less interested in low-hanging fruit, pun intended, in the most familiar sense. Lots of because nude guys with erections. And so what I have sought to do instead is to underscore what I thought was how profoundly queerness to turn it into a museum, to expand its remit in all sorts of different ways that the arts have long been a refuge more than erotica, right? Precisely in some respects,
Well,
because
you
they
succeeded,
found
Jonathan.
a
So I just
way
want to thank you
to make
for,
art speak out of
what
both sides of
you
its mouth.
helped envision, and that it's still, I mean, one of the only LGBT art spaces exclusively in New York City.
Yeah,
Um, Maybe exclusively in the US too. There's not many.
it's
Uh,
the only museum that continuously shows queer art in the world.
wow. Yeah, I just came from Miami. So there's an erotic art museum, but it's not necessarily just
Exactly.
LGBT erotic art.
Right, right.
So, getting into maybe the erotic sense because it's titillating, but I'm curious, like, how much in your exhibits you've curated have you responded, or in your writing, to pop culture at large? Like, for example, Playgirl, like trying to have a renaissance, and like the nudity of male models, like that kind of homoeroticism. Is that what you mean by maybe the most tangible? Like people see, oh, an erect penis or a
Right,
penis
right.
right in front of you. They're like, that's queer
Right.
art.
And I guess what I would say is that I'm less interested in low-hanging fruit, pun intended,
Yeah.
because it's obvious. And so what I have sought to do instead is to underscore how profoundly queerness structures world art in all sorts of different ways, that the arts have long been a refuge for queers, right? Precisely in some respects, because they found a way to make art speak out of both sides of its mouth, addressing one artist, one audience, a queer audience, to the exclusion of the mainstream audience. And it can do that at once, right? And that's what makes art so interesting to me. Its ability to speak multiply to multiple audiences with different competencies.
Mm. So what's been exciting? Um, do you ever go to your exhibit spaces when the public is there to hear their conversations or like see the interactions going on?
I mean, this is what I live for. This is the emotionally rewarding part after all the struggle and the 7 years it took to mount First Homosexuals. Um, because because people break down in front of paintings, and because they found themselves represented on the wall for the first time in their life. Because young lesbians say, "Oh my God, we do have a history." um, because people of color come to understand that it was not always the case that, say, African American culture was a difficult one, that it, in the early part of the 20th century, embraced queer culture in a way that dominant white culture did not. So it offers all sorts of perspectives that are incredibly useful to people today. And I especially love it when someone who isn't particularly familiar with history, right, walks into this exhibition and finds a paradigm shift. That's what I live for.
Mm. So when you were coming up with your exhibit, the first homosexuals, was there any, I would say, model or books or anything in culture that you recommend for those out there, almost like a pairing? Is there anything else that kind of is in the zeitgeist of your thematic analysis or idea?
No, which is why I
Okay.
did the exhibition and show to begin with. Because what we set out to do from the beginning was a global account. And we wanted to do a global account because the minute you move the focus outside of Europe and the Americas, you come to realize that for 80% of the world, homo and hetero had long coexisted, and it wasn't a problem. What you find is that it is a European perversion to be essentially homophobic and obsessed with this, and that unfortunately it would have stayed a European perversion except for colonialism, which on the back of other forms of conquest carried homophobia into parts of the world that didn't have it. I mean, after all, in the Arab world, love poetry was written to boys. It wasn't written to women. Um, and, when we show, which we have, images of men having sex with men from Iran, people are like, that comes from Iran? And I'm like, yeah, because Iran had a huge, long-standing, highly respected tradition of homoeroticism until it didn't.
Mm. So do you then, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like you're kind of suggesting that type of what Joseph Boone does in the homoerotics of Orientalism, which I absolutely love what he does with basically white male authors who kind of explore the seas of the Orient and Persian lands. I'm thinking of specifically Herman Melville here with his examples. But do you think that then, okay, the idea of homosexuality as what you're saying, which is the European Western, you know, framework from John Addington Symonds, Edward Carpenter, so many others too, that they're trying to fit this category onto lands that they colonize that already have systems of sexuality. Even the Native Americans have the two spirit and other kinds of ideas that
Exactly.
it doesn't fit neatly. So then those who are indigenous to that land see this idea of homosexuality and reject it because it doesn't fit their culture. Is that
Ab-
kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. And we see in the exhibition, one of the earliest works is, in fact, the earliest work, is a manuscript by Theodore de Bry from the Low Countries, 1594, an account of the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, which show the Spanish setting their dogs on Cueva indigenous tribes people, what is today Panama. Um, because they see them as men dressed as women cavorting with other men and decide that the Christian thing to do is to tear them limb from limb with wild dogs. And that's represented. So from the very beginning, colonialism carried with it the seeds of homophobia. And one of the things that I want to underscore here is that this exhibition, The Birth of the Homosexuals, uses that old name because we want to emphasize the historical nature of what we're saying. It is per se homosexuality we're talking about as a birth rather than same-sex desire, which of course we could never have a birth of because it's always been there and will always be there.
So, what was it like? And I'm assuming you have so many friends, colleagues who are artists and historians from so many different parts of the world. What is it like when you can collaborate or consort with each other about, your ideas and then learning about their systems of sexuality? Like, is there anything that you've found just really fascinating that, all of us could learn a really good, valuable lesson, especially when it comes to empathy here in this country right now?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I learned from the Japanist who contributed to the project, and I should say that the project was structured by me, but there were 22 historians from all over the globe who became the experts in their regions and
Mm.
helped to write the book and produce the exhibition. And the Japanist said to me that in Japan, there was no distinction between homo and hetero. And we found, in fact, a scroll from 1850 in which is about the sort of erotic education of a young man, in which cheek by jowl, he's sleeping with women in one as the top and the bottom with men in the next frame. And there's no distinction between homo and heterosex because there was no distinction between homo and heterosex in Japan. In fact, samurai culture was a homosexual culture, rather like the ancient Greek one, using our terms. But what happened is that when Japan was forced to open to the West, one of their first moves in becoming an empire was to outlaw homosexuality. Not because they had a problem with it. Homosexuality was endemic to Japan for thousands of years, but rather because the Japanese felt that the Europeans would look down on them if they didn't outlaw homosexuality.
Oh, wow. So fear from the European
Exactly.
colonizers.
And what's so interesting is we have in the exhibition a 1904 basically broadside that was carried by Japanese soldiers into the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 by the millions. Each of them had pockets full of these images. And what are the images? The images are of Japanese soldiers anally raping Russian soldiers.
Wow.
Um, to demoralize the enemy, right? To feminize the enemy. And indeed, it was the first major battle of the Japanese Empire, then nascent, and it defeated Russia.
Well, speaking of Russia, you have in your exhibition and in the Gay and Lesbian Review a whole article about Russia and queer modernism. And I mean, Russia right now, you know, so much going on geopolitically with Putin and the censorship that's happened with their queer community. But like, could you tell us a little about Jonathan that Russia and their idea of the homosexual or
Right.
same-sex desire?
I mean, this is fascinating because, in fact, what we'll find is that much of European modernism stems paradoxically from Russia. And it stems from Russia because the Bolshevik Revolution gave a shot in the arm to queer innovation until it became clear, unfortunately, that a queer utopia was not in the offing in the revolution. And then, of course, Russians started to expatriate. And many of the artists in the exhibition, the First Homosexuals, are actually expat Russians. And one of the great problems we faced was getting work from Russia, because obviously wartime made it impossible. But we were able to get things out of Western collections. But what I want to emphasize here is that the Ballet Russe, for example, under Diaghilev, was a fundamental laboratory for the invention of European modernism, both in movement and in costume and set design, and music as well. Um, and almost everyone involved with it was queer,
Hmm.
but its queerness rarely articulated.
Hmm. So this might seem, a naive type question, but I think it's really timely on everyone's mind. And I know you probably have a lot of thought about it, which is as you were putting together the First Homosexuals, or just where your mind is right now, and all of the research, the writing, everything that is in your brain, have you found any type of connection between a political system, like, say, um, a republic compared to more of a democratic society compared to an authoritarian or dictatorial society, and their openness towards same-sex desire? Or is it not that neatly bound to say, oh, the more democratic a system, the more open and celebratory they are of queerness?
So I think I would um, sort of use different terms. And I would say that indigenous cultures were overwhelmingly open, and colonized cultures and European cultures were closed. But the danger here is that those terms, of course, switch around. So at one point, India was one of the most open places in the world. Now, not a single work by an Indian artist is in the First Homosexuals because the work had to receive export permits. And because the exhibition was called the First Homosexuals, no export permits were issued, right? So it really changes. Russia is another example of this. To talk about sexuality in a loan form for a Russian museum ain't going to happen, right? Same for much of the Middle East. And yet, of course, at an earlier period, they were completely open societies. So what we have to understand is it's not intrinsic to the society itself, but actually paradoxically intrinsic to European colonialism.
So, if you're not comfortable answering this, let me know. But once in a while, I turn on The View, maybe just to uh, cringe watch it or see what's going on in trying to show the entertainment value of really frightening news and then making a laugh out of it. But recently this week, there was a whole debate about like not standing up for the Iranians, who you brought up Iran, because if you're gay, they're going to throw you off a building. And like, I'm just curious, like, how do you make sense of these types of, oh, I would call them straw man arguments, but the like, we're gonna not grant agency or rights to others, because if you yourself as an American went there, your rights would be taken away.
Right.
Like, yeah,
Yeah,
how do you make sense of it?
by drawing a profound distinction between governments and peoples. Um, I know a number of queer Iranians who live under threat of death on a daily basis, and still persevere. There's even one underground Iranian artist who photographs himself in drag at various spots in Iran that are elevated by the regime at night.
Wow.
But, he risks his life every time he does that, right? And those images circulate underground in Iran. So what I say always is, I don't trust governments. I don't trust our own government. God knows, especially this one. Um, what I trust are people. And when you get beyond governments and are talking to people, then that's where communion begins.
Wow. So powerful. So well said. I hope, more people realize that we're united as people, not necessarily united around a government, that we need to find each other's humanity together. So, something else that I thought was so fascinating is, you have discussions also of Paris and, I would say, metropolitan areas that just seem so ripe for the picking. Like, when you think of Paris and you think of homosexuality, there's just a lot of images that are conjured up. So, what was it like even dealing with the European, even though they might have ushered in homophobia? What was it like, though, also looking at the way that their communities um, exploded around queer art and homosexuality specifically?
Well, what we found very quickly is um, that what we now understand to be early queer art was in many respects in code. It wasn't widely visible. It couldn't have been widely visible. And France is a very interesting case in itself because, of course, homosexuality was decriminalized under the Napoleonic Code of 1804, which meant that it wasn't illegal. But the French were still fucking homophobic. And so what they did is to allow homosexuality, but to outlaw solicitation. So how are you supposed to meet other gays if you couldn't write cruise for them? That's the problem. And so what they did was they put police decoys in Pissoir and other parks in Paris and used that to dragnet and prosecute queers, even though the act of same-sex desire was legal. And that has historically been the case in France for generations, right? Um, and there's an early work in the exhibition by a French artist named Daniel Bouveret of his very good friends. He was straight, by the way, of his very good friends, Courtois and Van Stetten, were artist couple. Courtois is French, Van Stetten was German. This was right after the Franco-Prussian War, so this was a particularly charged pairing. And it shows the two of them walking arm in arm, promenading along the Seine. It's the first image we know of in the history of Western art of an actual real life gay couple. And
Wow.
what's interesting about it is the first question I had to ask is, how do we know this is meant as a homosexual image? Because, of course, in the era before homosexuality was widely spoken, men were actually paradoxically much freer to touch one another. Men would walk arm in arm and it didn't mean a thing, right? So how do we know that this is specifically a gay couple? And paradoxically, we know because the image also features a laundress. It's in fact called the laundress. And it features a laundress because French law, again, kind of working at cross purposes, allowed basically commercial sex allowed women to sell themselves and men to sell themselves, but outlawed the act of solicitation. And so the cultural norm in the 19th century was that sex workers were laundresses. And if you saw a woman in public with bags of laundry, chances are she was working.
Hmm.
And what that meant is that in this picture, there's a laundress who's looking askance at us rather than at the potential customers, telling us that she knows that this gay couple is not actually going to be interested. And that's what makes it the first queer picture.
Wow. No, thank you for detailing that. I mean, I think it's just so interesting what a picture or a painting just says about its society. And like I'm thinking, you know, that even what I love is there's a whole, if you can talk a little about it, when you get into Latin America, there's a whole investigation into men in uniform and like how even the military have some homosexual
Absolutely.
frame and lens.
Well,
So
yeah.
yeah.
In fact, the military almost across the world was a hotbed of homoeroticism because, generally speaking, young, horny soldiers in need of money and older queer men with money looking for them is a match made in heaven.
Now that it's summer officially, you know what that means. Beach reads. Well, I have the perfect magazine if you just don't know where to begin when it comes to which books to add to your to be read pile. The Gay and Lesbian Review is an incredible magazine that features book reviews, TV, film reviews, and such well researched articles. It's all about LGBT arts and culture. Make sure you head to glreview.org and you're going to see they have other magazines as digital issues. Use the promo code ITBR Choice and you get a free issue of the magazine. Their new theme is the situation. And in this issue of the magazine, it's all about connecting the current political moment, which every day we know takes a twist and a turn, and how LGBT rights, it's not the first time, sadly, that they've been threatened in America. If you don't know, look up the Lavender Scare and McCarthyism, and you'll see that government employees who were found to be homosexual or suspected to be homosexual were threatened and fired, a lot of them from their jobs. Also, there's an article about the Weimar Republic and censoring Magnus Hirschfeld's incredible sexology research in Germany. There's also an interview with the incredible trans writer and activist Jennifer Finney Boylan, whose book Cleavage just came out. And of course, the last issue was all about today's guest, Dr. Jonathan D. Katz's First Homosexuals exhibit. So I hope you enjoy your reading. And if you have any questions or you just want to gush about what you're reading in the Gay and Lesbian Review, please DM me.
Are you a fan of classic Hollywood movies?
Are you a fan of queer cinema?
Then do we have the podcast for you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Garcia.
And I'm Luke Del Mar.
And we are your hosts of That Old Gay Classic Cinema, where we take a look at some of the greatest films of all time and analyze them through a queer theoretical lens.
Let's be honest. LGBTQIA plus people have been a part of Hollywood since its inception, and this podcast celebrates those artists and entertainers of yesteryear while also taking a closer look at the queer-coded characters and stories in classic Hollywood films long before queer representation entered the mainstream.
So follow us down the road of classic cinema as we give you a guide to some of the films that touched our hearts, brains, and even gave us courage to be ourselves.
You can listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
All right, listeners, we're ready for our close-up.
So, for example, I'll get to Latin America in a second, but we have a landscape from Sweden in the early 20th century that looks like nothing like a queer picture. It's just a building in a forest. But that building is the headquarters of the naval cadets. And that forest was where they would cruise after hours, meeting men who paid them. And so it's the queerest picture that doesn't look like a queer picture. And in fact, one of the arguments that undergirds the entire exhibition is that by far the most complete archive of the history of sexuality in the world is actually art history. But we haven't consulted it as such. And that in part, this is enabled by the fact that painting can represent what words cannot say. In part because to utter words or write words is to author them. But painting is in the eye of the beholder. And what you see in the painting is up to you. You may not need to articulate it. You may not even be conscious of it, but it works on you. And so recognizing things in paintings or imagining things in paintings becomes almost a utopian endeavor to find a world that you want to live in that's different from the world that you currently inhabit. Now, in Latin America, we know, for example, that a group of gay men were photographing Navy cadets in Buenos Aires and photographing them in sexual acts. And the Navy eventually broke the code and found the people responsible and exposed it. And all of a sudden, this macho image of the Latin American sort of sailor was tarnished by this revelation that many of them had been engaging in same-sex relationships. But in fact, right, this had long been the code. In the 30s and 40s, one referred not to sailors in the gay culture, but the code was seafood. Because it was thought all sailors were available. And it's important to understand something here, which is that in the early 20th century, in many places, including the United States, homosexuality adhered to you not by virtue of the sex of the person that you were involved with, but your own sex and the sexual act. So if you behaved according to the masculine norm, and thus were top, it was irrelevant whether it was a boy or a woman that you were having sex with, because you were doing what men do. Of course, the person you were having sex with, if they violated the norm of their gender, they were the queer, but you were not. And what that meant is that in some sense, the entire apparatus of queer culture that we assume today, gay bars, gay neighborhoods, gay politicians, gay this, gay that, was not only not in evidence, but it was completely unnecessary. Because why would you segregate from straight culture if you needed a straight guy to do what made you queer in the first place, right?
Yeah.
You needed a top. Two queers in bed together couldn't do a damn thing, right? And so queer culture was integrated with straight culture paradoxically, and that's one of the points of the exhibition in the early 20th century in a way that it isn't even today.
Yeah, it's so interesting how it was more about trying to fit the sex act into gender norms. Like being a top, that meant you're more assertive and masculine. Being a bottom, oh, that's femininity.
Right.
Like that's
And
what women do.
right. And quite literally, as a man in America, you could have sex exclusively with other men. And as long as you were the top, there was nothing wrong with you. You were not queer, right? As long as you developed no emotional relationship with other men. You could have an entirely erotic life with men and not think of yourself as queer because you were the top. It wouldn't be marked, and you wouldn't be marked as queer. And so,
Yeah.
for example, there's a drawing in the exhibition by the great American artist Demuth called On That Street. That street is Sand Street in front of the Brooklyn Naval Yard, where Navy cadets on shore leave for the first time would promenade waiting to be picked up by gay men. And they were waiting to be picked up by gay men because, of course, they needed a place to stay. They needed a little money. They needed someone to take them out to dinner and show them a good time. And they got the rocks off as well, right? And all of this didn't mean that they were queer because they were being the tops. So what was to keep you from sleeping with another man? And in the Demuth, you see Demuth making a play for a butch soldier, but a queer soldier, or actually a queer sailor, is in the way, also making a play for the queer soldier, or for the straight soldier. And the straight soldier is looking at Demuth because he knows that he's got the money for the sexual interaction. And the queer sailor is looking at the straight sailor, and so and Demuth is looking at the queer sailor. So nobody's actually looking at the object of their desire, and it's a round robin of frustration because the whole point of this was supposed to be easy. You had money, I had sex appeal. It was an easy interaction.
So, do you feel that now in 2025, do you feel that the categories, and I know this is a complicated question, but I have to ask it since you are such a prominent theorist in queer studies, do you feel like we've lost the exploration or nuances, not saying that the system you just described was equal, and it definitely wasn't for the men labeled as queer, but do you feel like we've lost some of that essence of the integratedness of straight and queer culture because labels have become such a defining feature of people's identity? Like even, going from Pete Buttigieg to Peter Thiel, right? Two opposite sides of the political spectrum, but both used as tokens to show that, gay men have reached the pinnacle in politics. Like, it seems like that's different than what you're talking about.
Right. But actually, I would note something which I see in my undergraduates, which is a converse turn back to the terms of the early 20th century, which I even saw in my own family. I have a nephew who, after dating women, told me about a man that he was dating. And I said, stupid old guy that I am, oh my God, you never told me you were gay. And he looked at me with such disdain and he said, oh God, you're so old fashioned. Why do you have to label it? Nothing about me has changed. Why does dominant culture have to give it a label? I'm the same person I always was. And that attitude I see in my undergrads, right? They routinely say, my name is Michael, my pronoun is they. And what they're saying is, I'm not interested in these labels, male, female, gay, straight, none of that matters. And so I think we're actually paradoxically returning from a moment invested in homosexuality, which is what my exhibition is about. But we're now turning the corner and going back to the way it was before homosexuality, when ultimately questions of need, desire, and more fundamental questions like shelter and food were defining, not the gender of the person with whom you were having sex.
Is this a tease for your next exhibition, Jonathan?
Well, I actually have been sort of exploring this new world because, as one of the people who first started using the word queer, we were cognizant of the fact that the terms gay and lesbian were too easily categorized and boundaried. And that became a problem when AIDS became a problem because it allowed dominant culture to say, let them all die, right? As long as we were a minority, then they were more than happy to see that minority extinguished. And so a group of us came together and said, excuse me, let's not be a minority anymore. And what's so interesting about this, and we date this to the very moment that is the beginning of the exhibition, is that it's a debate between two of the defining figures in early queer history. On the one hand, we have Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, the first gay activist, the guy who wrote the first coming out letter, because he informs his family that he's about to speak to a conference of jurists in Germany in 1850s and announce himself as third sex. And he comes up with the idea of the urning, which he says is neither man nor woman, or rather is a female soul in a man body, or conversely, a man's soul in a female body. And he argues that we are born this way, and therefore, as a minority, we should get civil rights because it's an inborn trait. And he's disagreed with by another figure, early queer figure, Kerbeni, Carl Maria Kerbeni, who says to him, since when do minorities, born minorities, get civil rights? Lots of people are born minorities and they're still discriminated against. So that's a stupid argument. But it's also wrong, because, and he writes this in the letter, which is the first use of the word. He said, because everybody in the world universally is, in his words, monosexual, homosexual, and heterosexual. And he's inventing these words for the letter. Monosexual is masturbates. Homosexual and heterosexual, of course, we've used. And he says these are universal qualities. And if you want to build a movement for civil rights, don't do it on a minority model, do it on a universalist model. And one of the great ironies of history, therefore, is that we've taken his universalist term, homosexual, and applied it to the minority identity that the earning category, right, supported under Ulrichs. So we've given them both the opposite of what they intended. But it shows that from the very beginning, the question of whether homosexuality is particular, minority, or a universal tendency has always been the operative distinction.
So I feel like that tension is, not to leave everyone blue-balled with that tension, forgive my metaphor there. But, so do you feel from the work you're doing, Jonathan, so it's possible to both celebrate coming out narratives or coming out visuals, but also celebrate what can't be defined and maybe can be explored as queer? Like you can juggle both of these balls at the same time.
I am always juggling balls.
Always juggling balls. That's going to be the title of the episode.
Perfect.
No, I'm kidding.
Because I've always felt like I at once campaign or march under the sign of gay, lesbian, homosexual, trans, whatever the term is, at the same moment that I envision a world in which those distinctions no longer signify. And they are both realities for me. And you have to negotiate one to achieve the other. So they're not in contradistinction, they're in historical order.
Wow. Well, I'll let Jonathan Katz have the last word, of course. That was incredible. So how can, of course, everyone should get their hands on the GNLR guest issue that you did. It's called The First Homosexuals. And everyone can get it as a free issue. Just use the code ITBR choice. And everyone should get their hands on Jonathan's book called The First Homosexuals. Where, can they find that, Jonathan?
So it's released by Monticelli Press, which is an imprint of Phaidon Press, which is a big international press. It should be in every bookstore. It is a massive tome, 406 pages, 556 illustrations. And the person who funded the exhibition also subvened the book, and so it's only $75, even though it cost a lot more than that to produce. So it's a full color text, 22 international scholars, and a really deep dive into the early history of queer art.
And I'm assuming it's an incredible Pride Month coffee table type book as well.
And it's a big book. It weighs a ton. Order it by mail because you ain't going to want to carry it.
Good. So, and if you want to plug, Jonathan, anywhere you want listeners to follow you on social media or your website, now's the time. And if you don't have social media that you want people to follow,
I don't have social media. Okay. I don't have a website. I'm an old guy. But I am doing a number of queer exhibitions. And after the exhibition that's currently on which will be on through the first week of August at Wrightwood 659 in Chicago. I will be doing an exhibition next year called Dispossession in the Americas, which is about indigenous art and culture, its relationship to sexuality and sexual difference, and the way in which basically coloniality, especially in the case of the Spanish, right, violently rewrote those terms.
Oh, do you have an exhibit space or you're
It's also at
searching?
Wrightwood. No, it's at
Oh,
Wrightwood.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and maybe next year I'm going to try to make my way to Chicago. I've never been there.
Yeah.
And I've wanted to visit. So,
It's
uh,
it's a remarkably progressive city. And Wrightwood 659 is the only museum that I know of in the United States whose expressed mission is to challenge American museology and to attend to that which other museums refuse to articulate or show.
yeah, and as you've reminded us, there's a lot more work that has to be done when it comes to museum education and queer visibility. Uh, they just continue to erase queer artists and their work.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, ev
It's
yeah,
the
go ahead.
umbilical cord of gold. As long as it's tied to dominant culture and art is tied to dominant culture, then the 1% make the rules.
Yes. Yeah. And those one percenters, that's a different podcast.
Yeah.
So, everyone also in the show notes, I have Jonathan's bio from UPenn. So you'll see the catalog of his books. Please get your hands on his work. And Jonathan, this has been just such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
A real pleasure. Nice talking to you. Thanks so much for having me.